Hi everyone, I'm Danielle Byington, and in this video we're going to be talking about William Butler Yeats, also known as W.B. Yeats, and specifically his poem, The Second Coming. In his bio, a couple of things that's worth mentioning about him is that he is one of the Nobel Prize winners in literature. That's from 1923. Another big thing that's prevalent across his work is his support of Irish culture as an Irish nationalist. He is known for saying or discussing how he saw Irish playhouses in Ireland that were occupied or rented out by English acting troops. And he wanted to see a real, like, big sort of coming of Irish playwrights and their work being performed on the stages, so that some culture would be retained and renewed, right? So the other major thing we're going to talk about or focus on in his biography here, so it has a little more to do with this poem in particular, is his really eclectic religious and or spiritual beliefs. I'm saying and or here in this situation because he sort of doesn't have necessarily an exact label. He dabbled in a lot of things. At some point, so you see here in the first bullet point, he did grow up in London for a bit in his youth. Then he goes back to Ireland, but shortly after that, he goes back to London and he's kind of back and forth, and he goes to Europe a bit too after that. But in particular, after he goes back to London, sometime soon in the late 1800s, early 1900s, he becomes involved with groups that are interested in learning and or practicing types of esoteric religions or mysticism, well, and the occult, like everything that you could put under that sort of new agey umbrella. One of the things that he really gets involved in doing is after he marries his wife Georgie, they really get into something called automatic writing. Now, that's there are two ways you could look at this. So it was a sort of vogue to practice stream of consciousness writing at this time, the late 1800s, early 1900s. People like James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, like some of the major writers in that time period doing it. But it depends on what the context is. So when we're saying stream of consciousness writing, that's like if I tell you to sit down and write, whether like writing by hand or typing, just everything that comes to your mind. It doesn't matter if it makes sense. It doesn't matter if it's a bunch of random stuff. That is stream of consciousness writing. Now, the major writers were refining that in a way where they might go back and edit, or they're trying to like just nonstop have a plot, a narrative that is from that practice. So it's almost, it could be almost practically nonsensical. It's meant to be like a touch avant-garde, a little experimental. Okay, but then on the other hand, when we're talking about automatic writing and the way Yeats was doing it. So, yeah, technically it's kind of like stream of consciousness, but he and his wife were practicing it in a sort of spiritualism kind of occult, dabbling in the occult and stuff maybe you don't want to get involved in kind of way. And so the mostly his wife would do the quote unquote communicating, like get into this relaxed meditative state and just write like what she, I would say, quote unquote, heard. And he would do this too, but sometimes she would do the writing and he would be there, like very conscious, asking questions. And there are even points, if you are a student in my class, I have a PDF of his text from 1925 called A Vision, in which he talks about doing this. And at one point, he refers to the source of these things that are this unconscious mind, whatever it might be, that's answering his questions through his wife, or if it is just her stream of consciousness, kind of like putting all apprehensions aside and she's just relaxed in writing. Um, he calls those voices his teachers. Um, and you also see across his work, as you see in this specific poem that I'm talking about in this video, The Second Coming, when I say he had he had really eclectic religious or spiritual views, maybe a good way, well, to label it, while he did more predominantly dabble with things like, that are more like a subculture of than mainstream. He does have a lot of mainstream religion and the things he talks about as well. So something like Walt Whitman was a deist. I think now it's a more commonly similar, but not the same thing, to refer to yourself as a universal spiritualist, meaning like and I think the Unitarian churches usually kind of practice something like this. It's like you're taking all the messages, the positive messages of love, and accepting those, and all of the common links and those histories and all those different religious doctrines, kind of tailoring all of those into one narrative. So that's kind of where Yeats was spiritually or religiously, and you see that reflected in his work, specifically this poem, and the fact that the second coming is, you could say that on the surface, yeah, it seems like it must clearly have to do with Christianity, like the second coming of Christ. But most people interpret his ending, because it's kind of dark, is like it's something that looks like the second coming, but not necessarily. This is just the coming of the Antichrist, and it deceives people, it fools people. So let's actually look at the poem. You're going to see a reference to something he calls the gyre. This is part of his spiritual philosophy of not just like what's in charge of us, what kind of godlike entity is in charge of humankind, but this is kind of the like cartography, the map of how time has happened. It's very much kind of like the phrase that history repeats itself. So let me actually point to this in the poem. So let's start here. In the very first line, we have that reference, turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. So what you see, and there are all kinds of other illustrations of this concept online too. It's kind of like a big funnel. So a gyre is kind of like, you might think of it as like a cyclone. So it's whirling. That's what the spiral lines are representing here. So let's say in the beginning of it, that's the part where it's widening, when he says the widening gyre. Now, as it gets, that's where things are like, that's where humanity is at its peak. Like, we can't get any better than that. Now, as it becomes narrow, again, going toward the center here, that's when things fall apart. The center cannot hold. This is where we have lots of war, famine. Basically, we are destroying ourselves. And once you get to that peak, the most narrow point, that's kind of like the end of time. But then you see the pattern repeats again. And so like it's exactly the same thing over again. Things get wider. So you might think of that little narrow space right there. It's kind of like the beginning of 2001: A Space Odyssey, like the apes beating each other. It's very tribal, primitive. And then everything in the gyre is widening. We have lots of advancements and technology, and civilization is just like everything you could possibly dream of. And then it hits the peak point, the widest part, the widening gyre is going to stop widening. And basically, Yeats said that this pattern just keeps repeating itself. So we have the wide part and it gets narrow, it's the end of time, and then simultaneously it's the beginning of time all over again, and then it gets wider again, civilization's getting good, and then oh, okay, lots of terrible things in the world all over again, and the gyre gets narrow, and then time ends, and then at the same time again time starts over again, and it just keeps going. So it just is nonstop. You see another reference to this kind of concept further down in the next stanza in Spiritus Mundi. We'll talk about that in just a second. So this line, the falcon cannot hear the falconer, there are a couple of different interpretations of that. Um, think of an actual falconer, like someone in charge of the falcon. So it sits on their gloved hand. The falcon and the falconer have a trust with each other. And so, like, the falconer can send the falcon off to hunt, and it's always going to come back. But now, because the world is falling apart, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Some people say that some interpretations say that the falconer is sort of like the moral center of humanity. Like we've lost touch with that. If you're reading it in a more literal religious sense, it's saying that humankind can no longer hear God, that it's that they've become too far removed from listening and interpreting messages from a godlike entity. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. So everything is terrible out in the world. That description kind of reminds me of in my other video when we talked about no man's land in the World War I poetry, in Wilfred Owen's poem Dulce et Decorum Est. And it's just like there's nothing, there's no life, there's no hope. That's sort of what that setting looks like. And when it says the best lack all conviction while the worst are full of passionate intensity, that is just like violence has consumed the earth, and the good people don't speak up. Maybe they can't speak up. And so the worst, as it says, the worst then have like full run of the earth, full run of everything in their passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. So the Spiritus Mundi is sort of you can also look into psychoanalytic criticism, Jungian psychology, as in Carl Jung, Jung, who is really the one over and developed the concept of a collective unconscious. Yeats also talked about this being like a collective memory that we all share. Because we are all part of the human race. So no matter where you are from in the world, we all share similar anxieties and hopes and fears, right? So in the Spiritus Mundi, this is this anxiety that troubles his sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man A gaze blank and pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs, while all about it real shadows of the indignant desert birds. So this is usually interpreted as the Sphinx. And so we're talking about something from the ancient world. So it's saying this is something, a point in time that's from the beginning of recorded time, at least on this round of that whole, the gyre like getting big and small and big and small again, as history is repeating itself in all these cycles. And it's when it has this gaze that is blank and pitiless, it's not that it wants us all to die and the world to end. It's that it's kind of like it's seen it all before, or it's just kind of like it's inevitable that this is what happens across history, time and time again, going through the gyre. And those birds, we don't just see the birds, we just see their shadows. And so it's sort of like these pieces of the past that haunt us as that ancient piece of time is slowly moving forward to the place it's supposed to be. Darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. So this is sort of like all this time there was something waiting to be awakened. It was sleeping, rocking in its cradle, and now it has been awakened, and it is what rough beast? Its hour come round at last. And this is usually interpreted as the Antichrist or an Antichrist villain sort of figure from various villain-like figures at the end of time and other theologies as well. So it slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. It's kind of like just the way that the Sphinx is has a gaze that's blank and pitiless. It's like it's just destined to happen this way. Okay, that is all on that positive note for this video. Thank you.